Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention, maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. G'day and welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. A couple of little programming notes here before we get started I wanted to share with you guys. Some fans of mine down under have decided to add me to their new radio network in Australia. You guys might be familiar with Mike Williams. He's the host of the On the Road radio podcast down under, Australia's #1 trucking podcast. Him and some partners have gone out and started a 24/7 radio network that's available online in Australia and around the world. They've decided that they would like to include this show, and to them I say thank you very much. And to all of my new listeners in Australia and anywhere else, g'day, how's it going? If you would like to partake of Mike and Andy and Yogi's new project, you can download their very own app. If you're using an Apple phone, it's Australian On the Road Radio. Or if you're using an Android device, it's just called On the Road Radio. And you can listen to them whenever you like. It'll be a mix of trucking, general news, and radio programming, custom made for Australian truck drivers, I'm guessing. Perhaps truckers and other people around the world will enjoy it as well. One other announcement, I've mentioned previously, I'll be at the Mid-America Trucking Show in Louisville, Kentucky at the end of March with a whole bunch of other truckers and media folks. And as I understand it, Matt's is usually somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30,000 people in attendance, something of a big party. I've never been before. I'm looking forward to going. It's totally free to go. I think they want people to register, and they're trying to track via which way people do register, and they gave me a little code. So if you're a fan of this show, Voice of Gord, and you're going to Matt's, you can register on their website, and the code you want to use is ZVZTMZ or ZVZTMZ if you're using the Canadian alphabet, where we pronounce the letter Z a bit differently. Speaking of the Canadian alphabet, my guest today is a journalist in Toronto by the name of Alex Brown. He writes at the Acceptable Views Substack. I bumped into Alex last year online and discovered his writings. He's also written for the Western Standard and the Brownstone Institute. He's mostly covered the vagaries of the COVID regime in Canada, Canadian politics, and, much to my great delight, he's been a very good journalist in looking into the Freedom Convoy. Alex was very generous with his time. We had a long-ranging discussion, especially about recent revelations of the Chinese Communist Party getting up to its eyeballs in Canadian politics. It's all very scary and or interesting or fascinating, depending on how you look at it. I think you guys will enjoy the show. Other than that, I depend on you, my listeners, to spread this show around. I don't really advertise. I don't have any other social media outside Twitter. So if you guys, like I say, the best thing you can do for this show, which is free and for which I do not take advertising, is tell your friends. If you know another truck driver, send it to them. If you're talking with your buds about things you listen to while on the road, tell them about my show. Send them the Spotify or the Apple link. You send them to my Substack, autonomoustruckers.substack.com. If you guys have any feedback, any suggestions, if there's somebody you want to hear on the show, if there's some issue you would like me to address, if you want to give me hell about something, by all means, you can email me. Gordilocks, GORDILOCKS at protonmail.com. You can find me on Twitter at Driver Autonomy. I accept any and all feedback and would love to hear it. All right, well, without any further delay, we will get to Mr. Alex Brown. All right, good day, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Voice of Gord. I'm Gord, and this is my voice. The other voice you're going to hear today is that of Mr. Alex Brown, a fellow writer on Substack and someone who came to my attention from his coverage of the Freedom Convoy. And I'm very happy that Alex could join us today. Good morning, Alex.
Hey, good morning, Gord. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Where are you joining us from?
I am joining you from balmy Toronto, Canada, where we, all the crazy politicians are, and where we're just so proud of all our lockdowns and shutdowns and our crazy U of T professors and media personalities.
Right. And so how we met, I don't know what, so you and I both have done some writings on the Freedom Convoy, although I live in the United States now. I did go home to Ottawa to support it the first weekend. And about 3 weeks later, I got kicked off of Twitter, right around when the Emergencies Act was invoked, oddly enough. A similar experience with other Twitter people like Chris Erickson and Andy Lee. And I had not ever heard of you until this fall, probably September or October. You started popping up on my feed and I started reading your Substack, and you're a pretty impressive writer, dude.
That's very nice of you. I can't speak to the quality, but I think like many people, I was at the convoy as well. Not only did I write a piece for the Brownstone Institute about the sort of trek across the highways and across the country. I met ours on an overpass on the 401 and wrote about the people who attended. But I was there for the second weekend and a little bit longer for the convoy, so missed the horse trampling, but spent lots of time there. And when the threats from the government were starting to escalate. And like a lot of people over sort of the last 2.5 to 3 years, particularly in that time period, it felt like the right time to start speaking out on a different level and amplifying other voices and finding ways to find community online and in person of people who just knew that the way that Canadians were being treated and many Westerners, as a whole, and I mean, certainly without saying anything about the craziness going over in, say, China or Australia, New Zealand, was that this just isn't good enough, and we've lost the plot. And it's okay to say words like normal, and it's okay to want one's kids in school. That shouldn't make you a radical, and a little piece of cloth here and there, or just wanting to go to a gym or open your business. That the fact that people had been conditioned and so heavily and brutally and without thinking of the consequences to regard those all as threats and as just non-starters was so unfortunate. And so it's I guess I wanted to start speaking out. I'd already been doing some writing, and it was great to find some of your words as well. And then certainly quite a community of sort of heterodox voices and scholars, even politicians, writers, what have you, sort of seem to come together.
And did you have a background in journalism or writing before the last 3 years of insanity?
I suppose so. I guess I was sort of set up to not to cash in, not that I've made much on it, but I was working in communications, in politics. I'd studied political science with a minor in all kinds of English courses and creative writing, and through University of Toronto as well, and Dalhousie. I'd been published in a few places for short stories and what have you. And so I knew I could at least string a couple sentences together, and I hadn't been published in a couple years, but eventually I started sending out articles about, Doug Ford's driving me crazy. Here's why, and places like and he still does, even in a better year. And like the Western Standard said yes, and then the Brownstone Institute said yes, and it just sort of reminded me that I can do this not just on a professional level where I'm writing for somebody else and in somebody else's voice, or as this sort of third person organization that's keeping it a little bit more professional, I suppose. I can start writing more as myself, and then that led to some appearances on some radio shows as well, and sort of took off from there. And then now the Substack has been performing pretty well. I've gotten to meet all kinds of writers, and I've really enjoyed your work as well, some of your recent magazine work as well. And so it's I suppose a few of us were sort of predisposed towards having the tools to maybe find some community here, and to vent some of the frustrations on behalf of others, and to try to turn the tide towards sanity a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, Canada's a funny place, and so is its media ecosystem, as I'm sure you're well aware. And many of us have described it as sort of a mouthpiece for the Uniparty. And there's not a great deal of diversity of thought, as it were, amongst, the CBC, CTV Global, all the majors. And because of that, I think folks like yourself have developed some popularity and following, because Maple Pravda has not been doing anything to hold the government accountable whatsoever.
No, you can already see with, and if your listeners are unaware, a report in the Globe came out Friday morning that confirmed what there had been long held sort of whispers in the intel community, that the Chinese government had interfered in the 2021 Canadian election on behalf of the Liberal government, because in their mind, a minority Liberal government with Justin Trudeau is much easier to manage than a slightly more hawkish Conservative government, who, I mean, are not perfect on the China file as well, but are not as beholden, let's say, to foreign donors without getting into too much trouble.
Right. And well, on that note, so for my listeners, we're recording on Sunday, February 19th. This past Friday, some news came out about the Canadian government that, if we were not living in clown world, would basically sink any administration in normal times. We've had the CSIS document that was published by the Globe and Mail, documenting all these connections between the Chinese Communist Party, Trudeau, and his Liberals. And if I'm not mistaken, was there not a similar accusation and or information dump last year about the Chinese government bankrolling like 19 different MPs across various parties? Like this Chinese involvement in the Canadian government's been an ongoing concern, correct?
Yeah, there was, and it's but hey, they and the CBC told us there was nothing to worry about, and the CBC already, the way they framed the story is like conservatives lash out at, as opposed to perhaps rewording some headlines to say like, oh, we have a big problem here, and that's not just the conservatives lashing out at it. This was already a known issue. I have some sources, which sounds kind of silly to say, but I do. Sometimes people talk to me, and I will always protect their identity and such. But for years, I've been told, and I've just written about it. This problem is a lot bigger than people think, and we kind of have to. We're not looking the other way, but oh boy, we can't speak openly about it. And now we have the leak, the CSIS leak, our intelligence leak. And it says a lot as well, where if you look at the sort of follow-up story in the Globe that was published last night, that the immediate concern of the Liberal government is finding the leak, not the fact that they may have flipped a dozen ridings using like proxy organizations and good old-fashioned thinly veiled threats and a whole lot of cash on hand, maybe in maybe in traditional red envelopes. And so it's it's been pretty remarkable to see. It's still just sort of the Globe and then independent outfits like carrying this completely, and everybody else is choosing to focus on other things or making this seem like it is a conservative issue when it very much is a Canada, Five Eyes, Western stability issue.
Right. And on that note, it seems to me there's some analogy here with the Twitter files, which have been slowly leaking out since Mr. Elon Musk took over Twitter. And you see the same reaction to that in the American media, that it's a nothing burger, and they're completely dismissing all of the three-letter agencies like the FBI and DHS being up to their eyeballs in literally censoring the internet and in attempting to censor the media, like in direct contravention of the First Amendment. And there's this like super weird dismissive reaction to it. And in Canada, they just say, well, this is the Conservative Party conspiracy theory. And that's very troublesome, that our fourth estate is supposed to be, keeping an eye on the government and making sure they're looking out for the interest of their constituents. And instead, they seem to be beholden to other masters. And over and above the China thing in Canada, how old are you, Alex? Do you mind me asking?
No, I don't mind. I'm 34.
Okay, so I've got 10 years on you. When I was in my very early, 1999, I was 20 years old, and we had a major problem with these organizations called the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. And they were having all these like meetings all over the world and sort of like making these trade deals, which usurped local democratic control. And the left was all over it. We had the battle in Seattle. There was one in Canada at Quebec City that one of my friends went to. And it seemed like, the sort of left and center left and some parts of the establishment were legitimately concerned by these extranational, supranational organizations getting up in the business of countries. And now, fast forward 24 years, and we have the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the Chinese Communist Party, all of these organizations, which are outside of Canada and outside of the United States, are just over here telling us what to do. And the sort of mainstream media is to shrug your shoulders and dismiss this all as a conspiracy theory or not worthy of anybody's attention. Like, what do you make of all this?
It's been a pretty fascinating paradigm shift, and I think that's what has led folks like you and I on some level as well to writing more, communicating more. In your case, starting a podcast as well, appearing in all kinds of publications. Is I suppose I should be speaking to myself, but the left isn't acting like the left. And I can appreciate that power is alluring and wanting to protect, a certain level of your sort of ideological bend. Maybe you'll forgive a few indiscretions here and there, but like as you were saying, there was the battle in Seattle. There was a G20 in Toronto where Bill Blair, now of the Trudeau cabinet, was caught kettling journalists and protesters, and it was a big deal to our left-wing media at the time. The Toronto Star did care about it. And now the Toronto Star does not care that Bill Blair tabled yesterday's Emergencies Act report from the POEC, claiming that sorry about that whole horse trampling, no big deal. It totally met this high threshold, even though CSIS didn't need the threshold, and every policing agency, had told us that, existing powers would have gotten the job done. And it was a failure of leadership and application of the law, but not the law itself. And so that's been remarkable. We've seen sort of a rise of this sort of special interest influence. I think we saw this as well during COVID, where it was less about, say, your premier or governor in charge, and more about who could leverage sort of the most panic online, which organization could make that happen. in Ontario, it was frequently a group adjacent to our quote unquote science table who were very good at playing the media and then playing the premier's office like a fiddle. And they had like-minded media's ear who were similarly concerned and of a political ideology. And then away they went, harms be damned. And so we've seen sort of increasingly that the ends justify the means for a group that we once thought to be sort of more on the side of, you know, a workers of the world unite mentality. And you've seen moderates and classical liberals and conservatives now become sort of sitting there going like, okay, I guess we have to take up these old causes that you guys, you know, used to care about. Like, I never thought that I'd be sort of covering and writing about and sort of feeling passionate about certain mass protests on behalf of sort of the working class and those who felt hard done by and who had to support sort of the weight of a pandemic response while sort of limousine liberal champagne socialist types just sat at home and judged them accordingly while breaking all the rules they were hoping to enforce themselves. And I mean, it's not as if I was not uncaring to these issues, but it was interesting to be sitting there going, hey guys, like, I thought I was supposed to be the conservative in this situation. Instead, we have this this sort of boogeyman approach that you used to accuse, you know, prime ministers like Stephen Harper of, whereas this is the most authoritarian I've ever seen things in North America, and yet, you know, we're still the fascists. Evidently, we're still the problem by standing here and being inconvenient. But you can get away with all these things that back when you were in university and reading Trotsky for the first time, you would have been, you know, potentially just ashamed of yourself if you knew where you would have been 10 years later.
Yeah, one of the things that the COVID regime really did affect was people's perceptions of reality, or at least how they engaged in it, especially politically. Because we've seen, you know, we're 1 year into the Freedom Convoy, and people who were standing up against the government working with corporations to manage society with very little democratic input, you know, which I believe is one of the sort of doctrinaire definitions of fascism. You know, the Liberal Party and the administrative state working with large pharmaceutical companies, with extranational bodies to dictate policy here. The creation of this ArriveCan app, which is something like a surveillance state apparatus, and dictating to people whether or not they can earn a living and support their families. I don't know what to say to the people who believe that standing up against this makes you a fascist. Like I said, it seems like it's the inversion of reality, or at least the inversion of language, which I think has been spoken of before by people who've warned us about authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, they can come in a sort of banal way, I suppose, where maybe it just sort of creeps up on you, where you become so established and you become so insulated that you start to forgive the smallest of indiscretions, and then all of a sudden you've gone a little bit too far. I mean, uh, I trace some of this back to the 2016 American election. Like, I still think, and not to bring up just Trump almost as non sequitur, but it almost just felt like that loss shook a percentage of the population to such a degree, and sort of a very online percentage of people, like not necessarily symbolic out in the world walking around, but this sort of professional opinion class who were just, their sensibilities were so rattled by the fact that like a poor Clinton campaign could still lose to this like amusing just juggernaut of a Trump campaign that of course had its own flaws, that everything after that is acceptable because that loss was so unacceptable that you can now excuse just whatever to make sure that you don't hand over the keys to that guy ever again. And so now we're sort of living in this like post PTSD world where that trigger is so large for them, and their worldview was so rattled that it's we're on the side of big pharma now, and we're on the side of every large corporation because they kind of don't agree with him either, and the former enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we're all just gonna sell a lemon together, and we're all going to start acting out of character because we can't allow these people any quarter anymore. We view them just as these ne'er-do-wells, as the prime minister said, this sort of fringe minority of racist, misogynists, etc. I mean, we've all been called everything under the sun at this point.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, it got personal for a lot of people, like including myself. I have former associates and even members of my family who've effectively given me the silent treatment and or said really terrible things about me in other forums that I've come to find out about, and I just kind of have to roll with it. Do you see this like backlash, incredulity with the Trump phenomenon being imported to Canada, much as Canada always seems to import the neighbor's politics, like in the media's treatment of Pierre Poilievre? I'm not a huge fan of what Jeremy McKenzie refers to as schmoll peepee. I think he's a bit of a huckster and an opportunist, and I don't have any faith in the Conservative Party of Canada whatsoever, just to put that out there. But it strikes me that like establishment media in Canada are trying to make him into some boogeyman that hates women or whatever, and I don't get it. Like, do you have any insight into that at all?
My insight would just be that they always have imported American cultural issues and culture wars, often to fill the vacuum and the sort of undeniable truth that things in Canada in saner times are not normally that interesting. Like we can sometimes be the loft above like a pretty wild and raucous party, and you see it with the way that the Liberals are so consistently able to sort of leverage sort of certain concerns about gun control. Like they were just caught with legislation that made absolutely no sense, where they were more or less coming for half the hunting rifles on the market, but making them sound like they were these assault style, just spray and pray weapons, when you're having people and even sort of indigenous leaders going, whoa, like that's what I used to like hunt deer to feed my family. And so they've always been able to turn to certain wedges: abortion, guns, paint that boogeyman as able to creep up here and infect our politicians. And even though our conservative politicians are practically Democrats, or what used to be Democrats, now the Democratic Party down south has gone through a similar sort of post-Trump transition, where it seems like just everything is acceptable as long as it keeps the wolf from the door. But in the instance of the last couple of years, it's just been, you sort of imported this, even the mass sort of COVID freak out and the moralizing we saw with states like Florida and what have you in the early days. And in Ontario, all I can sort of keep speaking to is the crazy place where I live, which, for your listeners, Ontario had the longest lockdown in North America at one point, which was just a joy. And you had this sort of puritanical shaming of people in parks, and the mayor of Toronto, who has since resigned for personal indiscretions, not related to COVID, but related to he and his staffers. They had set up snitch lines. So it's like, oh, your family like took a walk on the beach, like report, be a good citizen, report them. And we of course know now, and that most people should have known at the time, that A, did nothing for public health, and B, just ended up just eroding trust permanently. And so you had this sort of journalistic class that was taking the streetcar by a busy park and going, can you believe all these people not staying home? And it's like, yeah, I can believe it, because those are the people that have been keeping your city, province, country running. And those are the people that live in, small homes, who don't have large backyards, who don't have large portfolios, and they're hurting and they're lonely and they have needs beyond patting themselves on the back for following what is increasingly a political ideology. And so it's just been fascinating to see that, and to see the moralization sort of baked into the reporting. And that I do believe that that was also imported from the US on some level. You often just see Canadian reporters almost acting as sort of this bizarro version of like a bigger American outlet or reporter that they admire, like a disinformation reporter. So there's, for every Taylor Lawrence down south, there's a Rachel Gilmore or something like that. And you just have these people who now seem to exist, not to speak truth to power, but power to truth, and function as this sort of scold, as opposed to what we once used to think of the media as, or say, what came from the Globe on Friday morning, actual dogged reporting and being inconvenient to powerful people, as opposed to helping them sell a message just because that message, is more agreeable than what those ne'er-do-well, unacceptable folk believe in.
Right, and that sort of narrative crafting and messaging to help the government has filtered its way down into other institutions. Last week, I spoke with an old friend of mine who also lives in Toronto, a school teacher, union representative, and kind of acts as like a go-between between her local union and the Ontario Federation of Labor. And I wanted to ask her about the question of why unions, especially public sector unions in Canada, had sort of like, abandoned the idea of bodily sovereignty, of their mandate to protect their members' interests, and also open hostility to the Freedom Convoy. And she had shown or spoke of a memo given out by the OFL where they were having this like internal conundrum where they really didn't want to use the same language about people's bodies, my body, my choice. It's sort of the basic notions of bodily autonomy, because in their minds that had been appropriated by the Freedom Convoy. And one of the things the media did was that, or some actors within it basically brought in this non sequitur of, well, the Freedom Convoy people don't actually believe in bodily autonomy because they don't believe in a woman's right to choose, even though nobody in the Freedom Convoy ever talked about that. It's a similar but separate issue that had nothing to do with what they were protesting about, which was the mandates. And seemed to me like it served as an example of importing the neighbor's politics, because abortion has always been this major contentious issue in the United States. And it struck me that they had to do that because they had no argument, and it made them look like the hypocrites they are for supporting the notion that your right to exist, your right to have a living, to support your family, to travel, to do anything was contingent on accepting this experimental gene therapy into your body. And like it was just hypocrisy the whole way down. But because they couldn't deal with that in their heads, they had to dissemble and use this language of scolding and of trying to invert reality. And I don't like, how do those folks come back from that? Like, how do we reach equilibrium again where, plain spoken language and legitimate argument and legitimate discussion are once again the order of the day?
I don't know how easy it will be, but I do increasingly feel more optimistic in that regard. And just back to the previous point, it was fascinating to see in a vacuum the bodily autonomy discussion. It should be like those should have been similar if you believe in one, you should believe in the other. But there was just this, in lieu of sort of having a stronger argument, there was just this inability to engage in anything but ad hominem attack, where it was just, oh, but these people are still gross and they still look like Trump supporters and they're still these sort of nasty bearded blue collar types, and often not actually. I mean, one of the things I found when I was at the Freedom Convoy or on an overpass taking photos and talking to people was, these were very diverse groups from different backgrounds, often Eastern European, who had, family with experiences with communism and who were worried that on some level this was happening here. But I think in sort of rebuke of the last, say, 2 years, there has certainly been, on some level, I believe that there is sort of some green grass growing through the snow, to borrow from a recent episode of Joe Rogan, where it is becoming more and more common to see the growth of independent media, to see this sort of ideological pushback for people asking for plain language, this realization that a very small percentage of people who are sort of adjacent to or members of our sort of chattering class have been influencing policy for so long, and especially sort of hyper woke, quote unquote, policy of late, and that there are parents and legal experts and professors and doctors now looking around going like, what the heck happened here? Like I have one of my friend of mine who I met during COVID, who followed my writing and I followed him, is and works in infectious disease in a high up position, and during all the fear mongering was sort of telling me like, if it's not quite on that level, but then was also telling me that these new kids coming out of med school, they're coming out like as politicians first and doctors second. Like they are so ready to like take to the ramparts to defend mandates and to turn everything into this sort of socio-political issue on the left. And they've already got these large followings where they don't stick to their area of expertise. There's this level of sort of epistemic creep all across the board that it's a problem for them, and they're concerned about it, where it's just like, are you going to be this sort of very online guy in the ER, or are you going to like actually do your job? And do you always want to be in a position where you're doing your work and someone could just Google you and find out that, the patient that they're working on, they don't actually like that patient or don't agree with them? And what kind of lines does that cross? And so I do believe we're in a moment where the sort of ordinary person is looking around and going like, I don't want to play along with this anymore. I don't want to. There was an element of go along to get along, but now we're getting too far here. We've got in Canada a medically assisted intervention into suicide program that the government offers, that they're now considering expanding to children. And,
oh my God! How many? Do you know offhand how many people have made use of this and like have exited this mortal coil with the assistance of the Trudeau regime?
Yeah, so the made use of is in the tens of thousands a year. From reading a recent report, I think it was this year was somewhere between 20 to 30,000, but don't quote me on that.
Oh my God!
Many of those people were suffering from legitimate debilitating illnesses, but there were some in there where it was they were responding to different levels of pressure, be it mental, socioeconomic. There's almost it makes good business sense to kill myself because I have an autoimmune disorder and I'm in pain and I'm broke, and the government is at least offering me this lifeline. And just how tragic is that? And so you have this mission creep, that's now happening across the board, where it's these policies we're starting to see the dystopian version of them. And if the road to hell is paved with good intentions, we've been off road for quite a long time. And it's I think your ordinary family now, if they pay attention to the news and not necessarily the mainstream news, they're sort of wising up to the fact that, like, oh, we've gone too far. We've gone too far with school boards. We've gone too far with MAID. We've gone too far with some of the sort of DEI approach to restructuring our institutions, where yes, it's important to be progressive and open-minded and to make everybody feel welcome, but it's another thing to uproot the competence of our structures and organizations entirely to continually sort of placate this sort of 5 or 10% of activists who give us a really hard time if they don't get what they want.
Do you
And
think
is
it's
that a
even?
way?
Do you believe it to actually be 5 to 10%? I get the feeling it's less.
Yeah, I think within an organization, maybe it's 5 to 10%, but on a population level, it could be one, it could be 0.5, it could be 0.0001. It is glaringly small. Like, I think we all had those moments during COVID, and I'm not sure where you are in the States. Do you let your listeners know of that,
Yeah,
or?
no, I live in upstate New York. I'm not too far from Canada.
Okay,
I'm a 3 hour drive to the border crossing at Buffalo, and about the same
okay,
to the one at the Thousand Islands Bridge.
okay, nice. Yeah, but my point was that you'd have this sort of fervor and sort of media induced, government induced behavioral psychological fervor where it's just everyone's staying home because no one wants to kill grandma, and it's only the most selfish sort of antisocial yobs who are out and about. But like, even in the sort of pits of lockdown despair, if you like went out and about and you went for a run or you went to meet up with friends and do like the speakeasy thing, there would still be community. There would still be people gathering everywhere, and they would not look the way that you were told they look, and they would not act the way you were told that they'd act. And people find a way to come together, and they find a way to make meaning in the meaningless. And it was that, to me, was heartwarming to see, and you could tell that there was still a spark there. And I think that spark exists now in when it comes to matters of institutional rot and incompetence and this sort of proliferation of speech policing and thought crime and wrong think and what have you, where it's the young parents of today and the folks who went along to get along are waking up and realizing on some level, if we don't push back now reasonably, this gets a whole lot worse. And it is a trap. It is a Chinese finger trap. The more you struggle with these issues, the more you let them sort of infect so many of your institutions beyond a reasonable measure. There becomes no way out of them because they all get protected by their own sort of brand of legalese and what have you. And you have these choked off school boards and
Well, and
choked off.
another thing that affects this is the sort of, get back to the term dystopia. In 1984, Orwell wrote about the Ministry of Truth and how they were constantly whittling down the number of words you could use and neutering people's ability to communicate effectively, and basically rewriting history and not presenting reality as it is. And with regards to the Freedom Convoy, a point that many people have made is that if you weren't there, if you were not in Ottawa or at one of the other protest locations, and you didn't know anyone in the trucking business or just a person interested in freedom at all that was connected to it or had been there in some way, and you went on television and you watched CBC or you went online and you heard from the likes of the Rachel Gilmores and Gerald Butzes of the world, it was just, Nazis running around Ottawa with pitchforks. And, this gets personal for me because a couple of my cousins like bought that narrative hook, line, and sinker, even though a whole bunch of people in my family are truckers. And I went to Ottawa and I took video and posted it on Twitter. And I paid very close attention to it all the time, and it was plain as day for anyone willing to look that the narrative manufacture was just that. But they keep doing it. Like the government continues to double down on it, and even in Justice Rouleau's uh, ruling and the commentary since, especially from Trudeau and Marco Mendocino and all these people, like they're still doubling down on lies. They're still trying to say that like Diagolon is an actual thing based on one guy with a patch on his vest. They're still trying to say that Trudeau said something about there's a small minority of people peddling misinformation that caused people to die. And like, this is the dude who greenlit MAID and has caused tens of thousands of people to die, tens of thousands of people possibly to commit suicide, leave the country, turn this place into an authoritarian cesspool. But like, people still believe it. And I can't wrap my head around like how much longer is it going to take for the forces of reality to get into these people's heads and shake them and say, guys, you've been lied to this entire time. And the 32% of the 59% of people who voted for Trudeau last time, if in fact those numbers are even legitimate, to stop voting for this nonsense and bring us closer to 1984. Like, I don't know, you're closer to the sort of cathedral north than I am. Like, do you have any sense do you have any sense that there's people in the media in Canada that are having some reflection on the role they played in basically lying to their fellow citizens about what just went on here?
I think some, but not many. Unfortunately, I still do believe that if you want, particularly in Canada, any version of an unvarnished or unspoiled, unsullied opinion or reporting, that you often have to look to more independent sources. Not that that doesn't exist in the States, obviously, with sort of the MSNBC, Fox sort of setup, and what a joke MSNBC has turned into. But no, I mean, what you've sort of seen is there's this kind of disinformation racket too that Glenn Greenwald wrote about recently, where you have all these people who claim to be experts in it, but the reality is that that expertise doesn't exist yet. It's like not taught in schools. There's no like credential for it. It just means that like I'm someone who spends too much time online and I don't like what I now view as conservative adjacent political behavior online. And so I'm going to just like write this report that links you back to da 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 da, which then I can just infer is like Russian. And then there we go again. Like, it's not a coincidence that the day before this China leak to the Globe happened, that the National Observer, which is a far left sort of eco activist online newspaper, published another report from another academic saying that the Freedom Convoy and their message was like inherently Russian and amplified by like Russian disinformation bots and servers, which again, I mean, it's disappointing in that there is still sort of a percentage of our professional class that will just immediately accept that as truth, as opposed to going like, hey, haven't you guys like gone to the well a couple times on this? And like, hey, didn't I know that one guy who went to it and like he wasn't so bad, and I actually agreed with a few points about it, but maybe I didn't agree with the execution. And like with you, like when I was at the convoy, like I didn't see anything. Like, there were obviously the early flags, one of which I think was just like the most obvious government plant I've ever seen.
That was the swastika guy, right?
It was either swastika guy or, to me, actually Confederate flag guy with that full sort of ghillie suit and the balaclava. Because I had heard from somebody there that swastika guy thought he was making like a point about how Canada's acting like Nazis, but it came off so clumsily that it was like, dude, what are you thinking? Like, he was an Eastern European man, but I can't speak to him. It was like brand new Confederate flag guy with a truck on it, ghillie suit, and everyone's yelling at him as he walks through the pit, and all the videos, people telling him to get the hell out of there, and he has no expression on his face, and he's wearing sunglasses. And I'm like, if that's not like a government spook, like I don't know who is. But it
Yeah,
was
well,
when I was there, I didn't.
can I make a point just about the rebel flag thing? Something that I think people outside, well, a lot of people inside Canada and a lot of people outside Canada don't know this either, that I thought was notable in its absence from discussion throughout any commentary on the convoy, is that the rebel flag, the Confederate flag, is got a long history of use in Quebec, especially by certain elements of the Quebec nationalist movement. So, setting aside the fact that this one guy was obviously like a government plant and a stooge, it seems to me like there's a part of the Canadian establishment that want to ignore the sort of like Quebec nationalist movement's appropriation of this symbol, because the forces of international liberalism have declared it beyond the pale to reference this history in the U.S. in a history which also includes people just wanting to not be ruled by a distant foreign power. It all has to be about slavery and racism. They've basically retconned any other consideration of ideas or meaning involved with this symbol, or the fact that like symbols and memes as such often take on a life of their own and don't always necessarily mean what you think they mean, depending on the context of the user. And there was just something about that, the Canadian media wanting to sweep away these hillbillies from Quebec, because one thing I noticed at the convoy was there's an awful lot of French people there. And
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. It was almost 50% Quebec. Like when I was doing radio, I tried to explain. I'm like, I don't think we've made this out to just be these like rednecks from Alberta, but it was just as much this discussion about how alienated Canadians felt, especially living in a province at the time that was under effing curfew. Like, hey, do you need to walk the dog at 9:01 p.m.? Nah, the cops are going to pull you over and harass you.
Right. And this is the thing, is like, well, the life in Quebec under Francois Legault had basically devolved into like an apartheid police state. And I don't think people realize that or know just how fucking bad it got. You know what I'm saying?
No, they had like nightly stop and frisk, and like Montreal, for example, has a large like Hasidic Jewish community, and those are family oriented people, and you'd be out, speaking with your brother or meeting with a large family, and you'd be in your regalia, or your regalia is the wrong word, but you'd be in your dress, and the cops would pull you over and give you a hard time. And I think many of us have seen the video of, I believe it was Yannick Pollock, the independent reporter, might be getting his name wrong, where he was out shooting for Rebel or Post Millennial or somebody, and the cop goes, "Are you Jew media? Are you out here being Jew media?" And you're going like, on what planet is this acceptable? And you had just silence from the left, and then you even had silence from some conservatives, because Francois Legault is theoretically a conservative, and yet he leaned into the worst of sort of anti-science fear and dogma as a means of controlling a population and sort of kicking a can down the road, because Quebec has terrible medical infrastructure, much like Ontario, and has just an atrocious situation in long-term care. And the population was made to bear the brunt of it, and particularly, sort of more vulnerable or cultural communities. And we all just pretended that was okay in a Canada that pretends it's the progressive beacon of the world.
Yeah, I remember that journalist being harassed. And I showed that video to my wife, who happens to be Jewish, and like she just couldn't believe it. I'm like, "Yep, it's 2022, and members of the police are allowed to say stuff like this, and the media ignores it because the cops are the good guys this time, right?
There was
Like,
no reporting on that. Literally no reporting on that because for many reasons that we've touched on, but also, oh, he's like rebel news adjacent. So we can never signal boost these people, even when they do good work, and even when they do, through their plucky individualism, shine a light on real issues that are a concern to millions of Canadians, because they're viewed as, again, like this sort of deplorable group that's just dangerous at all costs, when there were real indiscretions going on that were, so easily just cast aside because they were happening to those other people that Canadians aren't supposed to care about.
yeah, I don't. I want to move on from this part of it because we're like relitigating the past, but at the same time, like I don't know if I'm ever going to get over the sort of scapegoating and outgrouping that went on.
I
Um,
think you can tell we probably never will if we sort of went back to it reflexively.
yeah, well, I mean, but this is the thing, though, right? Like, as far as like moving society forward goes, we do have to reconcile what went on, and I mean, the trick is that we can't. I don't know if we're ever going to get it out of the government. I mean, like I said, this ruling comes down on Friday. And under normal circumstances, the politicians involved should or would resign. And I mean, and with the CSIS thing about Chinese involvement, like in any normal circumstance, two pieces of news like that happening at once to any government would mean the opposition would go into full on attack mode, or the parties involved would like resign or issue some kind of mea culpa or say they're going to get on it and fix it. And we've seen none of this. I mean, even Poilievre, like there was a Poilievre made some kind of announcement about the ruling, and like he keeps going on about the cost of milk and taxes, and it's too expensive, and he's forgotten basic fundamental principles of society that like the government doesn't get to fire you from your job, they don't get to enforce medical apartheid, prevent you from getting on an airplane. Like the crimes of the Trudeau regime are so much more deeper than, whoa, inflation, bro. Inflation, bro. Milk's expensive, bro. Like, Poilievre is like the most milk toast useless opposition leader next to Jagmeet Singh, if I may.
And you may, it's your show. But yeah, no, it's you can tell that there's an element of marching orders with the Conservatives, where it's our previous support of certain things like the convoy or sort of anti-lockdown sentiment has been used as a bludgeon to beat us with by the media. And while Pierre sort of publicly, privately, still very much believes against those things, there's an element of like, just stay on your messaging. So you should say that this is inappropriate, and you should say that the justice's ruling, for example, in regards to the Emergencies Act, I still think this was inflamed by the Prime Minister, and let's all be honest, it was. But there's keep going back to the pocketbook issues to like court the undecided and to court those percentages of people that keep sort of abandoning the liberal ship as life gets too expensive. And so I'm not sure we're going to be seeing them touch any sort of social third rails in any meaningful way over the next year or two. And then it all really kind of comes back to the sort of performative nature of this sort of liberal NDP coalition that the media says is not a coalition. Because in any other circumstance, the NDP and Jagmeet Singh would pull the plug here, right? But there's more going on behind the scenes than they let you in on. For every time he launches into some non sequitur rant about grocery store executives, he's not telling you that he's kicking the can down the road because the NDP is broke. They're flat broke. They can't campaign. They can't fundraise. He is not really popular internally. They know the party isn't growing, and if there was an election right now, that they would perform similarly to worse. And they don't have a great ground game. They don't have any sort of particularly strong sort of ballot harvesting campaign system, which we now know is so important, as the Democrats have practically have superpowers because of it. And some of it is actually quite legitimate. Like, they're world class at knocking doors and getting you to mail in vote, like, while they're watching you do it. Like, they practically show up with the envelope neatly pressed. And that's what it's going to take to win elections in a system now that has deliberately been made more difficult for certain people to win elections. And it's really just exposed the nature of this sort of farcical parliamentary setup at the moment, where this, in any other country, G7 nation parliamentary government, this would dissolve it. This is a big deal. They can't just yada this away and go, oh, we're going to find the leak. That's the real story. And, oh, the Conservatives pouncing is the real story. No, the real story is that the Chinese government helped Justin Trudeau get elected. And particularly, and if you go through sort of the reporting, they wanted him in a minority too. They like him in a minority, which makes you wonder, then what's Jagmeet's role there? It's not as if Jagmeet is smart enough or cunning enough to maybe be getting as big a piece of the pie. But it's like they almost know that, like, a liberal sort of minority coalition, like, they just will be so feckless, will be so toothless that they'll be their perfect sort of proxy partner and or doormat.
Right. As I said in response to your recent Substack, it's the Bamboo Republic. And on the point of Mr. Jagmeet Singh, something that I wondered when the Emergencies Act was scuttled, and then, in the immediate aftermath of it, where Trudeau made this deal with Singh, because Trudeau understood the financial and electoral issues the NDP were facing and took advantage of it and offered Singh this coalition arrangement, whatever you want to call it. I thought to myself, like, the left aren't completely vacuous and stupid. I mean, there's some smart ones there, and I would have thought that there would be some people within the NDP who would have mutinied against Jagmeet Singh in saying, like, you've just given your approval to this weaponization of the nuclear option, which was the Emergencies Act, and you've set a precedent for this to be used against us in the future, or against one of our client groups, like, say, a public sector union, or maybe a radical environmental group who might have a protest in the future. And then say a future Pierre Poilievre invokes the Emergencies Act against them. Like, there's somebody in the NDP who must have understood this. And I had this, like, secret flickering candle of hope inside me that there would be a small group within the NDP who would go rogue against Jagmeet Singh, and then contact the Conservatives or the Bloc Québécois and organize a confidence motion, and to hell with Jagmeet. But, like, that never eventuated. So, like, as much as it's easy to blame Singh, and I mean, he's a vainglorious twat and he deserves everything he's got coming to him. But, like, the rest of the NDP, like, what were you guys thinking? Like, where's the old firebrand left? Where did they go?
I think they were either made to go inward or they went to another vocation, because the issue that this sort of comes back to is we're now in an era where it's like party subservience is the rule, never the exception, and everything is hyper whipped, and anyone who steps out of line, gets a boot out of caucus or a cabinet, or gets immediately shuffled, told they can't run for re-election. Even the Ontario Conservatives have done this to more principled politicians like Roman Baber, who stood up during lockdowns and just went, like, look, like, I grew up Eastern European, like, I witnessed this firsthand. I'm not a fan of this. Surely we can do this. We can do this differently. And he was castigated accordingly. And so it's not as if maybe there aren't some old school lefties still in the NDP who want to be rebel rousers and to stand up for the working man, but they have to go along to get along too. And like, anytime anyone now does anything against the party, the media also pounces on it in a way, the mainstream media pounces on it in a way that further sort of disincentivizes it. Like, like every now and then with the Liberals, like an MP like Anthony Housefather will just be like, I don't want to vote for this, like I'm not sure. And that always becomes like front page news for like a hot second on the Toronto Star. And it all of a sudden you have this extra sort of light shone on you, and you're going to get extra sort of an extra chewing out from the PMO and advisors. And it used to be normal for there to be disagreement within a party, and now it's viewed as a sort of, how dare you give our opponents any sort of leverage, give them any sort of in. And so the system now isn't set up particularly well for any kind of feedback, because it's just full on tribalism. It's not actually this sort of complementary and cooperative parliament that theoretically the British parliamentary structure should be. And you see it in the States as well, right? Where it's our side no matter what. Even if, we don't agree with this senator, or we don't agree with this governor, or what have you. It's like they'll always end up voting for us, even if we view them as like on the Trump side or the DeSantis side or the this side or the that side, or even the Democrats who have their really kooky left-wing side. They'll still sort of mix in with the Dixiecrat side, and everyone will just sort of vote accordingly at the end of the day. Maybe one person goes rogue, but it's never more than that. And so that's going to be a real institutional problem in the years to come, where it's not as if people don't start out as more principled when they get into politics, but to survive inside the apparatus, to make it more than one term, you are now expected to just sign yourself over to the party.
Yeah, I posed this same question about the NDP directly to Charlie Angus on Twitter, and he blocked me.
Of course he did. He blocks everybody.
Man, I should know this because I sort of dabbled in like punk and indie music when I was a kid. But what band was that guy in?
I don't know. I do know that some of those guys used to be kind of punk rock. Even like Warren Kinsella, the former Liberal strategist, used to be in a punk band as well. And so
Wow.
the sort of the aging, I know, so the aging the aging hipsters are not as rebellious as they used to be. Like now they're just these proxies of power, and they still, just because there's like a Ramones print on the wall doesn't mean they still have any of that punk rock left in them.
Yeah, the COVID regime certainly inverted more than just language and ideas. It took some people and just I don't know, man, just shook their brains around a little too hard.
Yeah, it exposed, I think, the limits of the political spectrum. Like if you think of that sort of compass, the sort of political compass where you sort of look at this XY axis. And I remember seeing a sign when I was at the Freedom Convoy where someone was holding up that just said, "There's no more left and right. There's only up and down." And I thought about it, that was actually pretty appropriate for a group of, for this largely sort of bipartisan protest of people from all different walks of life. That you weren't there because you were a liberal or a conservative. It's because you had a problem with that top corner authoritarianism. Like it wasn't. I think the interesting thing is, as the last few years has shown us, is that we're still capable of creating libertarians. They're not just like this like dying breed. Like we've got a couple million more after the last few years, which has been kind of fascinating to see.
Yeah, they just don't seem to have any representation either in the media or politics. I've dabbled in libertarian politics over the years. The Libertarian Party in the United States, until very recently, was something of a gong show. They just had a takeover by the Mises Caucus, which might not sound terribly warm and fuzzy to some, but they're a little bit more grounded in reality. I don't know about Canada anymore. I haven't lived in Canada for like 7 years, so
I'd say you timed that pretty well.
Well, it was never. What's funny is, as a kid growing up, I drank the Kool-Aid, man. I was full board CBC, liberal Canadian, Maple Leaf on my backpack when I went traveling. Listened to CBC radio all the time. Read the Globe and Mail. Paused libtard, so to speak. And the older I've gotten and the more places I've traveled, I've realized all of that was a manufactured lie. Most of it was BS. And I didn't think Canada was going to stoop this low. But yeah, I guess I did sort of time it right, and thank the Lord for my American wife.
Yeah, you timed that well. We all be so lucky. It's yeah, no, it's cultural identity stuff can often come from somewhere of truth, but then over time it is just over polished and turns into something corporate and hollow entirely. And that's sort of how I view the sort of packaging of Canadiana now, where in reality it's just this sort of thin veneer of passive aggression and sort of corporatist statist culture.
Well, it's interesting that that's all been sort of happening in slow motion, and then we have the revelations from CSIS about Chinese involvement. And no offense to anyone from China, this is all about the Chinese Communist Party and the ideology which it is infused with, right? That in addition to affecting our political classes, you have to wonder how much of it is affecting us culturally with this like sort of uniparty way of thinking, castigating your neighbors for not doing what the party says, like the sort of creeping communism of our transition into this new bamboo republic.
Yeah, it'll be like it will be interesting to see some of the ramifications of that. Also, like if to anyone who knows anything about China, like it's this influence would be mainland Chinese. This would be Beijing, the Beijing apparatus. This wouldn't be. This would exclude the majority of sort of Hong Kong families or adjacent sort of organizations here. And so it'll be on a cultural level, yeah, and like in certain Mandarin communities, um, how influential have these sort of proxy government organizations been? You hear about, the potential for sort of threats at the front door, and this just sort of implication that you're going to go along, get along with them, and not cause any trouble. We know now that, and I, like a few people had heard about this a long time ago, that the Chinese do operate surveillance and intelligence operations on Canadian soil and Western soil when they can, hence even some of the balloon discourse, which is both inflated like a balloon, I suppose, and also true, to think true at once. It's been sort of, the balloon exposure has been slightly over the top, but they are up there, and some of them are hobbyist balloons and some of them aren't, and some of them might be sharing information with other powers and what have you. And so it'll be interesting to see if there's any sort of pushback from sort of certain Mandarin communities in Canada if, say, next election, someone shows up at their door again and with a bit of cash and says, you know what, the guy in the blue, he doesn't have China's interests at heart, or your version of China's interest at heart. Like, we're going to ask you to do so and so, and will that happen again? Where will these potential investigations go? And will the Liberal government just try to sort of sit on them and squash them and spend more time trying to find the leak on the CSIS end, as opposed to doing the right thing and finding, the problems inside their government? And I think we all know the answer to that, because they know how many people have been impacted by this. And there are much bigger stories to tell if certain reporters will be allowed to tell them.
Right. One thing I wonder, to bring the Americans back into this, is these revelations from Friday, the sort of ongoing issues with the Communist Party of China doing its thing in Canada. Some in a sort of grand chessboard, 30,000-foot view of things, the bipolar nature of geopolitics is now sort of the United States versus China, and to a lesser degree Russia. Do you think maybe there's some people in the American intelligence establishment and their sort of like, deep state, as it were, who might be a little bit concerned with this foothold that the Communist Party has with the next door neighbors. I would think this should be setting off alarm bells south of the border. Have you seen anything in American media or heard anything about any expression of concern from our southern neighbors?
You might see something on Fox. What I do know from being somewhat plugged in with this stuff is, and it's in my latest piece, I had somebody with intel sources saying the sort of Five Eyes security network, which includes the United States and Canada, has often been reticent to share information on China with Canada because there was seen to be the high potential for a leak and influence. And so those alarm bells have certainly been going off for years. The links have been there. They've been in sort of, the call's been coming from inside the house. And so you'd have to think that certain things would be floated to Canada. And then you sort of wonder, well, is this going to get back to Beijing? Then for all we know, you throw some false information in there too to see what goes back to Beijing, because then that proves, oh yeah, that definitely was Canada. And so it will quietly be setting off alarm bells. But whether we see anybody go on public record who isn't a conservative is hard to say, because there's an element of trying to protect your narrative right now and protect your projection of power, that everything's fine, we're not compromised, business as usual, nothing to see here, folks. But there's a lot to see here, and this has been building for years, and it's bigger than anyone imagines. Even now, it goes quite deep. There's people speaking hushed tones about it, and we'll see where it ends up. It's we sure know that in Canada, our Liberal government, in the States, the sort of Democratic establishment right now, they'll do all that they can to cover it up.
Like I said, I would think that this might be raising more alarm bells south of the border, but the deep state does as the deep state does, and the president, being this cognitively deficient, stottering old man, and who knows who's in the background that's actually running the show and what their priorities are, but they certainly don't make any sense to me.
No, and the priority certainly, much like in Canada, doesn't seem to be the sort of average American, average Canadian. I think that we know now that the priority is not the working class, it's not industry, it's not the people who keep the lights on, it's whatever student union designs we have right now, and these sort of passion projects that people don't actually vote for but are then left holding the bill for.
Right, but and all of this sort of points to, the Freedom Convoy as a symbol of the Freedom Convoy was very popular around the world as a symbol of sort of populist revolt against this technocratic international government system that seems to have affected the entire West. Like, our governments don't represent us anymore. They represent, Klaus Schwab. They represent the Chinese Communist Party. They represent faceless corporations. And, I really believe the Freedom Convoy, even though it was narrowly about the mandates in Canada, touched on that nerve, given that this same problem, although it looks differently in different countries, is pretty much the same thing. Like, our democracies are not democratic. Our politicians don't represent us. And we have a problem here that's not being addressed whatsoever, especially if you're just a regular working person.
And how big a problem is it when it's the Canadians who are saying enough?
Yeah,
that to me was
real.
always sort of the fascinating element of it, where it's like you push the Canadians too far. And I love Canada. I'm so thankful for all those who have come before us and given us this wonderful opportunity. that many are squandering. But and it's not as if there wasn't sacrifice in Canadian history through war and efforts to build and all kinds of wonderful things. But there's obviously an element of subservience and passivity in the population. And to see even the most homely and well behaved drive across the country, that says a lot. That says everything, really. And that it was so popular. It was more popular around the world as well, because there wasn't this sort of massive state messaging apparatus and sort of broadcast apparatus that was hammering the people at home for it. Like, Americans and Europeans reported on it with such a difference of opinion. It was like they were seeing it with fresh eyes, whereas at home we were constantly being told, like, well, actually these people are bad. Well, actually this is bad. Well, actually they don't know what they're talking about. And you had, people in the news in the States, and you had people in Britain and politicians going, well, no, let's hear them out. And if they've been pushed this far, surely they have justifiable reasons. Whereas back home, we had the CBC and the Toronto Star and Global and CTV to tell us that we were all sort of thought criminals for sharing, some of the concerns and hopes and dreams of these people.
Yeah, and that's reflected in my own experience too. I mean, I just happened to be in this weird crossroads with going between two jobs at the time Freedom Convoy was happening, and I'd sort of had a little bit of success on Twitter and on some podcasts talking about trucking issues, because, like, I'm a trucker. It's what I do. I've been doing it my whole life. And then I started writing on Freedom Convoy, and the only people that really would give me any time of day were the English, Americans, and Australians to a lesser extent. I was on like 12 podcasts over the course of a couple of weeks, and they were all outside of Canada. All of my writing has been for publications outside of Canada. Like, nobody in Canada wants to talk to me or even acknowledge that I exist. But which I found very weird, but also in keeping with the sort of insular and self-referential nature of the Canadian media ecosystem. It's just a shame. And I living here in the U.S. when the Freedom Convoy was happening, I saw more Canadian flags. And when I would talk to people, like at work or just out and about, and they'd be like, "Oh, you're from Canada?" "Yeah." "Oh man, I'm so glad what the Freedom Convoy is doing. It's about time somebody stood up to this. It's about time somebody, stood up to the government and everything that's been going on." And I don't know how many people, like both online and in real life, like Americans, said to me, "Man, I'm never going to look at Canadians the same again. I used to just make fun of you guys all the time, but like, you got more nuts than anybody else."
I know, and yet, and I heard something similar, and walking around Ottawa with friends or contacts or what have you, or strangers, I would often just catch myself going like, "Oh my God, this is Canada. Like, what happened here?" Like, and you kind of laugh. You're like, "Wow, like the Canadians really did step up. Like, who knew?" And whereas if you diverted off Wellington Street, it went a couple blocks away, there might be somebody throwing a cup of coffee at you for even thinking of holding a Canadian flag in those circumstances, because they've just been getting bombarded by the news and their own little echo chamber. And we all have our own echo chambers, much as we try to avoid them. And they've just been made to view it as such a third rail, whereas I do feel like the sort of international press and the American media, and they were able to view it in a much more sort of impartial manner.
Yeah, and thanks to them. I would hate to think that the Freedom Convoy just ended up being like a different version of Dieppe, but instead of landing at Dieppe, we're at the mouth of the Yangtze River. If I might stretch a couple of analogies. Alex, you've been very generous with your time, man, and I really appreciate it. Do you have any parting thoughts? Do you have any idea of where the investigation into these CSIS revelations is going to go in the next few weeks? Like, what do you think?
Gee, that's That's tough to say. Thank you, Gord. It's been nice to connect here, and thank you to your listeners for sticking it out with us this long. I think you'll probably see the usual. I mean, the timing on this is circumspect, which is that it went into a long weekend on a Friday, and anyone that knows anything about media and media training is that you like always dump bad news on a Friday because you avoid a news cycle, and it's a long weekend in Canada as well. And so we'll be back Tuesday, and the Conservatives and Pierre will have a fresh new line of attack on China. The Liberals will have a fresh line of messaging saying we've already investigated ourselves and found ourselves not guilty of any wrongdoing. And it might take a miracle inside the structures of power and how they are right now to come to any sort of meaningful conclusion or to bring about any sort of justice. But I think people are going to keep digging. I think often with these stories, this will now light a spark for other investigative reporters of the independent variety to go digging. The China files were already well reported on by Canadian journalists such as like Terry Glavin. And so now they're going to have even more to work on. You're going to have even more sources now who want to speak out because they know that it's safe to do so. And if they feel passionately about this issue and concerned about this issue, they're going to want to add to the dog pile here. So whether this continues to destabilize an increasingly unpopular sort of liberal NDP coalition, I believe that will happen. But in regards to just your general monkey business in modern parliament, I'm not expecting it to dissolve anytime soon, but it's going to be a show, and it's the Liberals have, you get the mess that you deserve in this case. They've done so many people wrong. They're obviously beholden now to a foreign power. They stopped caring about the little guy so long ago and actual liberal issues that now they're going to replay so.
Right. Well, it's just a shame that Trudeau's probably going to drag this out until 2025. The suffering of Canada will continue, but you'll be there to keep writing on it. Pimp, where can everybody find you?
Yeah, I'll be there to keep beating my head against the wall, and hopefully it's sooner than that. There is always a chance that he takes a walk in the snow, or they know that they have to shuffle the decks at some point. But folks can find me on Substack. It's called Acceptable Views, where they're more than welcome to check out some of the things I've been writing about, including the China file and all that. And so and I hope they check out your Substack as well, because I've really enjoyed some of your columns.
Wow, thanks very much, Alex. And you're on Twitter as well.
I'm on Twitter at AlexBrown17. If you feel like listening to me all day, I don't necessarily recommend it, but if you ever want to, maybe small doses.
Right. All right. Well, again, thank you very much, Alex. I really appreciate your writing. Thank you for making the time for myself and my audience. And happy trails, man.
Hey, thank you, Gord. All the best.